Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 279. I'm the host, Kyle Anslone. Today I'm joined by my Libertarian Institute colleague, Patrick McFarlane. Pat, how you doing?
Doing good, Kyle. Good to be back.
Absolutely happy to have you back on today. I think this is the first time you're on the show since you officially have a title at the Institute. You're the Justin Raimondo Fellow, and you are certainly living up to, the expectations of a title like that with a couple of these articles that we are talking about today. The atrocious Republicans, Adam Kinzinger and Lindsey Graham. So if you want to share today's show, get it out there to more people. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. Pat has a weekly column there that you absolutely must be reading. He is doing a fantastic job. And then you can also find the show on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. Pat, your show, Liberty Weekly, is up on all three of those platforms as well, right?
It is, yeah.
All right. And then you can follow the show on Twitter at con_interest. Donate at Patreon, Subscribestar, or crypto. All that information in the show notes page. And you can support the show by buying your CBD products through our sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Use the promo code PEACE to get yourself 20% off when you spend $75 or more. And they have a fantastic lineup of products at Paloma Verde. My personal favorite is the sports cream. But if you like CBD and you just want like the regular gummies, 10 milligrams, they have those. They're a good price. They work great. Lab test results right there on the website. But they also have, treats for your dog. You could get some lotions or soft gels. So lots of great stuff at Paloma Verde. Just again, be sure to use the promo code PEACE when you check out to save yourself 20%, and it gets the show kit bed. So it's a great way to help yourself live a better life and to support your favorite podcast. All right, Pat, let's get into this. And I want to start off today by talking about your article on Adam Kinzinger. And this one titled, Adam Kinzinger Executes Neocon Vision for Ukraine, from May 5th at the Libertarian Institute. And Pat, just go ahead and break it down for us.
Yeah, well, first off, I want to say I really appreciate your accolades, man, and having the title of Justin Raimondo Fellow is certainly a huge honor for me and massive shoes to fill. So I'm glad that you think that I'm at least living up to that a bit with this article here. And it was the great work of Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com that kind of turned me on to Adam Kinzinger and his AUMF that he proposed in the House. And thankfully, that AUMF has not gotten a whole lot of traction, and it appears to be dead in the water. But it made me want to look into Adam Kinzinger and who he is and how he got into this position of being able to propose such legislation. And so I took a look at him. Adam Kinzinger has been in the House since 2010. He is a rhino, a Republican in name only. Since he's been in that House position, you can see his fingerprints all over Ukraine. And it goes back to kind of in March 2014, he was sitting on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And when during everything that went down with Maidan in Ukraine, he issued a statement pledging that the House would back the Obama administration's efforts in Ukraine, stating that the House would consider legislation calling for increased aid to Ukraine, up to and including adding Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. So this is hugely provocative. And this statement, again, it came very soon after the 2014 Euromaidan revolution. And so, there's a lot of that has been said about U.S. involvement and U.S. State Department involvement in that Euromaidan revolution. And so that's, of course, when things really kind of kick off the beginning of the civil war that Russia says that it's just ending with its military action in Ukraine that began in February of this year. But after that statement in 2014, in 2016, Kinzinger co-authored H.R. 5094, which was known colloquially as the Stability and Democracy for Ukraine Act, the Stand for Ukraine Act. And on September 21st, 2016, this act passed the U.S. House unanimously by voice vote. And the act was engineered, quote, to contain, reverse, and deter Russian aggression in Ukraine, to support the sovereignty of Crimea against Russia's illegal annexation, and to ultimately assist Ukraine's democratic transition. And so at the time, Jason Ditz, also of antiwar.com, had a piece out, I think that was cited in Sputnik. And I kind of globbed on to what Jason was saying in that article because I think it's so true, is that essentially what the Stand for Ukraine Act did was put the United States down a path with Russia where solving the Ukrainian, where normalizing diplomatic relations would become untenable and impossible because the Stand for Ukraine Act, it lobbed sanctions onto Russia and said that those sanctions couldn't be released until Crimea was returned to Ukraine. And so, of course, that's not going to happen. Crimea is incredibly important to Russia, being one of their only warm water port, and for a myriad of reasons that Connor discussed on my show. This historical tie with Catherine the Great to Russia. So it's very important to the Russians that they have access, that Crimea is part of Russia. And there's a lot to be said about the lease of Crimea as a naval port to Russia. But now that they had that Crimea joined Russia in that overwhelming the vote, but also the coup de main that happened. So having those relations that are not being normalized really sets us down this path to where we're at today, locking it in like that. And if you look back, Adam Kinzinger is instrumental in that. And so since February 2022, Kinzinger has repeatedly pushed to escalate the Ukrainian situation. He was one of the first politicians to call publicly for a no-fly zone over Ukraine to, quote, prevent Russian air attacks. And of course, if enforced, a no-fly zone in Ukraine would see U.S. forces shooting down Russian planes and even possibly attacking targets in Russia. So I thought it was funny, and I wanted to include it because Adam Kinzinger's his press release cited his experience piloting an intelligence aircraft in Iraq and Afghanistan, saying that, oh, well, Adam Kinzinger, he's heroic. He knows when a no-fly zone is warranted and called for because he flew an intelligence plane in Iraq and Afghanistan. So therefore, he's qualified to make this huge diplomatic call that is incredibly risky. And I wanted to poke fun at him at that because it's just absurd, such an absurd proposition. So then I also kind of went back and I looked into Adam Kinzinger's connections to neoconservative think tanks. And so if you go back in time, you see him joining the American Enterprise Institute in 2014 for a panel discussion with Fred Kagan. And during that panel, Kinzinger underlines how dangerous it would be for the United States to leave Afghanistan. And of course, since 2014, all of the United States efforts to build a government, a functional government in Kabul has just fallen apart. And we saw with the U.S. withdrawal, all those 7 years of U.S. support made absolutely no difference from Adam Kinzinger's 2014 panel appearance at the American Enterprise Institute. And he went back for another panel on April 15th, where he kind of talked against and warned against the Biden administration's plans to withdraw, and said that it would be it would recreate a terrorist haven. This idea that Scott talks about the safe haven myth that Afghanistan is uniquely positioned as being a terrorist safe haven just doesn't really make sense. So he's peddling that idea that we've heard a million times before. And so basically I say, since the U.S. withdrawal, a lot of bad things have happened to the Afghans that no one seems to care about, including freezing the central bank assets and, food insecurity and food crisis in that country. So just kind of admonishing Kinzinger for his positions there and his involvement with the American Enterprise Institute. And beyond AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, Kinzinger has also been involved with the Foreign Policy Initiative, which Robert Kagan, the other Kagan brother, and Bill Kristol have been deeply involved with. Fortunately, it's now defunct, but of course those figures have not gone away. the Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol. But this event he spoke at on May 26, 2016, was also hosted by the Hudson Institute. And there he talks about America's narcissistic foreign policy, which I it's just an absurd proposition to me that the United States would be involved all across the world, up in everyone else's business. And Adam Kinzinger is saying that it's narcissistic for people to want the United States not to be involved across the world because, of course, it's selfish that we, the notion that we wouldn't use our benevolent power to rule over everyone else. So here's a quote that he says at this Hudson Institute and Foreign Policy Initiative appearance. He says, "Our involvement in NATO is not because we just want to defend Europe out of the goodness of our heart, but because without NATO, we never would have been able to drop the Iron Curtain and bring freedom to millions of people and make us safer. Are there challenges? Of course, but that needs to be done in the context of how do we get NATO re-engaged versus let's just get out of the rest of the world. That's a narcissistic foreign policy." So I go and I talk a bit about the Weekly Standard and Robert Kagan and their involvement with the Project for a New American Century and being some of the thought architects behind the global war on terrorism. Then I also I make a parallel to Robert Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, who was the an assistant secretary of state during the 2014 Euromaidan coup. So you see that connection there between these neoconservative think tanks and Victoria Nuland's position and being involved in the 2014 Euromaidan revolution. And so I talk about, the famous phone call, the leaked phone call. And I also talk about the Hudson Institute because if Kinzinger is speaking at an event hosted by the Foreign Policy Initiative and the Hudson Institute, it matters, exactly what their position is. And so the Hudson Institute is described as being an aggressive Israel-centric U.S. foreign policy promoter of that position. It was founded in 1961 by several dyed-in-the-wool Cold Warriors, including Herman Kahn, who is a one-time Rand nuclear war theorist who's notorious for his efforts to develop a winnable nuclear war strategy. Kinzinger has also spoken at the Atlantic Council, which is a think tank that has long pushed increasing confrontation between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine. The Atlantic Council is funded to the tune of millions by weapons manufacturers, the United Arab Emirates, the Rockefeller Foundation, Goldman Sachs, Facebook, JP Morgan Chase, and Palantir, which is a Peter Thiel connected entity. I think it's also Palantir is connected with DARPA, which is kind of described as the Pentagon's brain. So I think, it's not exactly clear how much influence that these neoconservative think tanks have had directly on Adam Kinzinger's policy positions. But it's clear that he's rubbed elbows with them. He's familiar to them enough for them to invite him to their panels and speaking events. And I mean, we see it played out in the policy positions that Adam Kinzinger takes and the legislation, the influential legislation that he's introducing and putting forward.
Yeah. And Pat, I think some of this is just, the connections and the social club aspect of it that really does help lock in people's perspective, right? Like, if you and every smart person at the Smart Person Conference says that we have to confront Russia, then that's going to make you all the much more adamant about it. Also, it's, probably a way to, move some money around, right? You fly you out to a nice conference at their, nice facilities, put you up in a nice hotel, feed you a very nice dinner. All that's a way to get money from Facebook, the weapons makers, the UAE, to the individual congressmen by inviting them to these conferences and, letting them live a little bit more, a very luxurious style. When somebody does that, smoozes you a little bit, like most people react. And my guess is that a congressman particularly is susceptible to that kind of treatment. Very good, like outlining all this background on the Illinois representative, just because, he's the guy that introduced this AUMF to go to war with Russia. And as you said, My initial fear when I first covered this, Pat, was that the Democrats are going to love it. And they did it. Great. Absolutely perfect. But what happens in 3 months when, now that either because it's actually happened or just because of propaganda, they generated three new scandals claiming that Russia's using biological weapons or chemical weapons in Ukraine? Do they then, because it's just going to sit there. It's not like they're going to vote on it and he's going to be the only person that votes for it. It's just going to sit around. And so then if it sits around a little bit and people are looking for ways to signal how much they love Ukraine and how much they hate Russia, or is he going to start picking up co-sponsors? And then by the end of the summer, we're now looking at AUMF with 20, 30 co-sponsors rather than none. And what does that actually mean for the viability of this bill? And so I do think long term there. Do you have any idea? So a few people have mentioned, and it seems to me to be the case, that he won't be in Congress next year, that he's kind of gotten redistricted out of his seat. Do you have any idea on if he's announced any future plans? Or, I mean, I could see him taking up like, the token Republican spot at MSNBC, so they could be like, here, look, here's a Republican that agrees that Putin is really bad too.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about his future plans, but there's always names that have come up in the like a presidential run milieu, and I've seen his name mentioned. I don't know that he's particularly popular, but I mean he's been around for a while, so he must have some kind of base.
Well, and whenever, let's say the Republican stage is Trump, and then you got like Pompeo, Christie, Cotton, Graham, and Kinzinger, it's going to really, like the overall message will be extremely hawkish. And I guess in the case of Trump, he kind of reacts to like a consensus by being more against it, so it can almost work out well for him. But if it's not Trump and say DeSantis, who seems to be a little bit more susceptible to the political pressures and the political will of the day, I think with a politician like DeSantis, you could really maybe move him on these issues. If everybody is way out here on the right and very hawkish, he may look to move out in that direction. Even if he doesn't, go very far, he'll start going in that direction just to cover his right flank a little bit. So I do think, that's one of my real concerns. But you mentioned him as a presidential candidate because they're all going to be bad from the Republican side. Nikki Haley, ooh, that's
Yeah,
another really,
yeah.
really bad news there. So anything else on Adam or the AUMF before we talk about Mr. Graham?
Yeah, well, I think it's great that you bring up because I cited you directly in my article mentioning the point that you had made in your antiwar.com piece about how, before the invasion of Iraq, Joe Biden made a comment on the 2002 AUMF saying that it wouldn't lead to a wider war. Well, look where we're at.
Right. And in fact, he's specifically citing like, oh, this is just about leverage for weapons of mass destruction. Now, it is a little bit of a different situation and everything, but the parallels there are pretty striking. But I really, really like this article, Pat, that you wrote. It was just the spotlight at antiwar.com this past week, titled Lindsey Graham Spearheads U.S. Regime Change Effort in Russia. Pat, tell us the bad news.
Well, Lindsey Graham has been one of the worst figures in Congress on the Ukraine situation. He's just been completely awful, and right from the get-go, I mean, for years he's been pretty hawkish on Russia. Well, hawkish on pretty much everything that exists, every foreign policy decision in the United States. But so even before the invasion began, Graham announced that he was working with his Democratic colleagues, this bipartisan foreign policy consensus to, quote, create a task force of the Department of Justice, Department of State, Treasury, and maybe the DOD to go after Russian oligarchs, adding, quote, he said, I want to see cops take apartments, fine art, and seize yachts from a bunch of thugs and crooks. I want to put money on the table to have more weapons for Ukraine to fight. I want more protection when it comes to cyber, and I want to go at this big, and I want to go at it hard. And so you can see he's setting the tone from even before the Russian invasion happened, and from there you can see that at least there are parts of the foreign policy establishment that are showing their hand that their real goal is regime change in Moscow. And I guess we don't even need some kind of a lexicon to figure that out, because basically Lindsey Graham has come out and said it this whole time. So after the invasion on March 3rd, Graham introduces a Senate resolution condemning Vladimir Putin and other members of the Russian state as war criminals. The resolution unanimously passed the Senate on voice vote on March 15th, but it also proclaimed support for investigations of Russian war crimes pending at the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. So I also thought that this was funny, because the United States has routinely attempted to undermine the jurisdiction of these judicial bodies, especially for war crime investigations into Israel over the Palestine situation. And I believe like the United States has explicitly exempted itself from the jurisdiction of at least one of these courts. I know there were investigations into like Nicaragua, and I don't know if that had to do with Iran Contra, but it's just something that I saw in my research too that I didn't necessarily want to add to the article for length.
The Trump administration sanctioned the ICC because they wanted to investigate U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. I did look when Lindsey Graham wrote this, and I couldn't find any particular statement he made in support of sanctioning the ICC, but he certainly didn't condemn it.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, and it's just so much hypocrisy that you see from Lindsey Graham and throughout all this. I mean, everything that he says, and I get into it later when he talks about labeling Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. He mentions all these things, and like U.S. involvement in Chechnya and in Syria, he cites, and the United States hands are just as covered in blood, if not more so, than Russia in these situations. But so that's just one example with proclaiming support by political convenience of the ICC and the ICJ. But that same day, that on March 3rd, when he introduced the Senate resolution, Lindsey Graham took to Twitter to voice his desire that, quote, somebody in Russia take this guy out, referring to Vladimir Putin. And Lindsey Graham's comments were so ridiculous and so extreme that even his fellow Russia hawks like Ted Cruz were calling his suggestion, quote, an exceptionally bad idea. And I cited Dave DeCamp's article at antiwar.com for this, so it's research I got through him. But Lindsey Graham tweets, is there a Brutus in Russia? Is there a more successful Colonel Stauffenberg in the Russian military? That's a reference to one of the Nazi generals that tried to assassinate Hitler during World War II. Lindsey Graham continues with this tweet, the only way this ends is for somebody in Russia to take this guy out. You would be doing your country and the world a great service. So a week after making that tweet, and the tweet rightfully kind of caused shockwaves and kind of left a lot of people aghast throughout, well, the nation and the foreign policy establishment, but just sane people everywhere, basically. But a week later, on March 10th, 2022, Lindsey Graham appeared on Fox News to pressure Joe Biden into providing MiG-29 fighters to Ukraine through Poland. And so Lindsey Graham does this thing where he tries to talk tough, but it just, I don't know, it just comes off like an act. But he called the Biden administration dishonorable, saying that it, quote, folds at every turn when it comes to Ukraine. And near the end of the interview, Graham doubles down on his tweet from March 3rd that he had made a week earlier. This is March 10th. He says this on Fox News. Let's see. We overestimated the Russian capability, and it's basically saying that Ukraine is doing better than we thought that they would. He admonishes the Biden administration for thinking that Ukraine. Basically, he says that the Biden administration thought that the Ukrainians would fold up in a few days, but he said that's not the case. We overestimated Russia's capability. So he says Russia's biggest nightmare. The Biden administration's biggest nightmare is for this to end badly with Putin because they don't have a plan for him to go. Lindsey Graham says, I want it to end badly for Putin because I want to get rid of him. Then on March 16th, Lindsey Graham introduces an additional Senate resolution which urges the Biden administration, quote, to facilitate the transfer of aircraft such as MiG-29s and air defense systems to Ukraine. He also had a corresponding press conference on March 16th where he said, how does this end? We cannot let Putin get away with this. After 20 years of murder and war crimes and thievery, it's led to this moment. Every time he did something outrageous, the world complained, but not enough. Now he's crossed the Rubicon where there's no going back. If he's still standing when this is over, then you can almost bet that Taiwan goes and that Iran will become more belligerent. So then it's almost kind of like the domino theory in a certain sense. But the very next day on March 17th, Graham again took to Fox News. It seems, I think that Fox News has like a regular segment where they have Lindsey Graham on very often. So Lindsey Graham gets on Fox News. He poo-poos the possibility of a nuclear exchange with Russia, but then he escalates his rhetoric even more, especially this regime change rhetoric. He says, and this is so, I mean, it's just bad play acting, like a B or a C level script. He says, if you're looking for scum and traitors in Russia, Putin, look in the mirror. You're the scum. You're the traitor. You're the guy who should be facing criminal charges or be taken out. I don't consider Putin a legitimate leader of Russia. Russia is suffering under Putin maybe as much as any other time in history, which is a ridiculous statement to make, by the way. So when I say he has to go because he's a war criminal. He's a murderer. He's a thief. He's a disruptive influence. He wants to recreate the Soviet Union. The way he goes is when the Russian people turn on him. The purge I'm looking for is when the Russian people rise up and take him out. So yes, I want to give my voice to the idea that he's not a legitimate leader. He's a war criminal. He needs to go, and I'm urging the Russian people to bring that about, to end this reign of terror. That's what I believe. I believe it with all my heart. So he says that March 17th. And then on March 24th, Lindsey Graham is a really busy guy. On March 24th, in his next regular Fox News appearance, Graham calls for Joe Biden to repeat his regime change rhetoric. He says directly to talking about Joe Biden, what I would like the president of the United States to say, I want him to say, I believe Ukraine can win. I'm committed to them winning. I will hold Putin accountable. He needs to go. He's a war criminal on an industrial scale. So 2 days later, on March 26th, 2 days after Lindsey Graham says this on Fox News, President Biden gives the speech in Poland where he calls for regime change in Russia, saying Putin is a butcher, saying, for God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. Then a couple weeks later, on April 5th, President Biden, because his press team tried to play off the Poland speech as some kind of a gaffe. But on April 5th, a couple weeks after the Poland speech, President Biden cites the Bucha attack, and doubles down on this rhetoric, saying basically that Putin is a war criminal and needs to be held responsible, which, I mean, if he was held responsible, then he would be taken out of power. He'd be convicted and ostensibly imprisoned. So Lindsey Graham praises this interview that Biden has. He's getting off a helicopter. You could see the footage. But Lindsey Graham praises Biden's remarks, saying there can be no forgive and forget when it comes to Putin. We must hold him accountable for the rule of law to mean anything. So Graham continues towards the end of April. On April 22nd, he gets back from this whole trip to Australia, Taiwan, and Japan, where he just, he focuses on the regime's main enemy, which is China. So he stokes tensions over there in the Pacific and the South China Sea by making this tour to all of our strategic allies in the area. And once he gets back, he gets right back on the regime change in Moscow train, saying, right now there should be nothing left on the table when it comes to Putin, and we should put every form of weapon within reason into the hands of the Ukrainians because they're willing to fight. Then on May 10th, he takes his legislative weapons further, co-authoring and introducing another Senate resolution, And so this resolution is, I think, the most concrete and dangerous step towards the goal of actually achieving regime change in Russia. The resolution aims to denounce the Russian Federation as a state sponsor of terrorism and would call on Secretary of State Antony Blinken to make that designation. So in his corresponding press statement, Graham makes it clear that the declaration intends to, so this is where he shows his cards. It says, this is the point of this. He says, we need to let the Russian people know that our fight is with Putin, and as long as he remains your leader, engaging in these activities, you will be isolated on the world stage. So he wants to cause pain to the Russian people so that they will maybe get up and overthrow Vladimir Putin. And we've seen this take place over and over again. Iraq comes to mind specifically in the 90s.
I mean, they're currently doing it, though, to North Korea, Venezuela, Iran,
right,
Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, the Zimbabwe, Libya, and so it's Nicaragua, Cuba, and so it's not like Lindsey Graham can't look around the world, randomly throw a dart at the map, and even if he can't actually figure out what country it hit, if he goes on Wikipedia and looks up that country plus U.S. sanctions, he's probably going to find that the U.S. tried to regime change the government that way, and it just doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And at least, we have the example of Iraq during the 90s and the famous Madeleine Albright clip where she says that, the interviewer asks her, we've heard that 500,000 children have died because of your sanctions. And we're just wondering, is the price worth it? And Madeleine Albright says, yes, it's a hard thing, but yes, to us, the price is worth it. And, there's some back and forth about the numbers there, but at least as the question was posed, she took the 500,000 number as being accurate in her answer. So shows her state of mind. But so then with this declaration to name the Russian Federation as a state sponsor of terrorism, Graham also penned an op-ed for Fox News in support of it, released the same day. He called it 4 Reasons to Label Putin's Russia State Sponsor of Terrorism. And in that, he doesn't actually give 4 reasons why we should label Putin's Russia state sponsor of terrorism. He just says, oh, here's 4 things we could do to Russia if we named them a state sponsor of terrorism. So this is what basically the designation would do. It would restrict U.S. foreign assistance to Russia. It would ban U.S. defense and export sales to Russia. It would impose certain control over U.S. exports of dual-use items to Russia. It would allow the U.S. to impose additional financial and other restrictions on Russia. Graham says, importantly, this designation is a clear message to the rest of the world that doing business with Russia is a bad idea and will come with severe consequences.
And I really think that the only thing that's different, Pat, from everything else that the U.S. has already done is the very end of that last sentence. And what putting a country on the terrorism list does is it criminalizes other countries doing business with that country. And so I think the way most normal sanctions that the U.S. places work, you're not necessarily committing a criminal act to violate them, but once a country's on the terrorism list, you would.
I see, yeah, and I wanted to make the parallel too to the Adam Kinzinger piece, because with the Stand for Ukraine Act, what it did was sink the United States into deteriorating diplomatic relations with Russia, and this is just another very severe step in that direction. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Kyle, but this would be basically rock bottom.
Yeah. I think if you look at what's happened when the U.S. has put countries on the terrorism list, it essentially just ensures that the policy stays forever. If you look particularly at Cuba or Iran, that's what's happened. In Iraq, it took Bush going in and overthrowing the government to remove them, but the sanctions didn't obviously work, and it just locked in that hostile policy that we had through the 1990s. And it's one thing if the Treasury is threatening, to put secondary sanctions on countries for doing business with Russia Russia. But it's another thing if the DOJ is going to go after them and prosecute them for doing so. And I think that's what Lindsey Graham is trying to do.
Yeah, so going forward, Graham's op-ed accuses Putin of, quote, having terrorized innocent civilians all around the world. And he cites Russia's involvement specifically in Chechnya, Libya, and Syria. And of course, I had to editorialize there and talk about how the United States is equally, if not more, covered in blood than Russia in those situations. So I just say that the United States has no moral standing to accuse Russia of war crimes. With Libya and Syria and in Chechnya as well. So, and then, I just have a line in there about the United States support for the neo-Nazi Azov battalion as well, going into, the fog of war right now in terms of all these allegations of war crimes going back and forth. It's really hard to kind of disseminate and get to the bottom of what exactly is going on. So then I just basically say, once that designation is made, it's going to be rock bottom in relations, but it's also going to lock us into this path of regime change, but also this path on the way to war, and really risking that, saying that there's two ways to remove a nation from the state sponsor of terrorism list, and this would require, quote, a fundamental change in the leadership and policies of the government of the country concerned. That's one option. The first option would require that, but both options would require the president to certify and report to Congress that the subject nation has not provided any support for acts of international terrorism in at least the preceding 6-month period, and that the government concerned has provided assurances that it will not support acts of international terrorism in the future. And I don't know about you, Kyle, but I just don't see that happening.
Right. Well, and then the other thing is it's such a political issue. So if we could look at two countries like Iran and Sudan, Sudan had to bribe its way off the terrorism list, literally paid a very, country with a lot of poverty had to pay the United States hundreds of millions of dollars to be removed from the terrorism list, even though they already overthrew the dictator in that country that the U.S. was accused of allying with terrorism. I think that was probably an overstatement given the U.S. role in supporting and, working with Sudan on the Osama bin Laden issue. But either way, they overthrew Bashir, and then years later, the Trump administration removed them from the terrorism list once they paid the U.S. a settlement. And now with Iran, you could see that the Congress is working to prevent, who knows how interested the Joe Biden administration actually is in making a deal with Tehran. But assuming they are somewhat interested, the Senate is now using the political leverage it has with the terrorism designation on the IRGC. And I know that, there are different terrorism designations and everything like that, but they typically play out the same way, that it's going to be used as a political chip. And, how could you possibly take Russia off the terrorism list, Pat? Do you support Putin's terrorism? Is going to be the accusation.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I just don't see, at least as it pertains to the immediate conflict and the immediate crisis over Ukraine, this would lock us into this position for the foreseeable future. And it's incredibly dangerous. And I talk about, the escalation, these allegations, at least Washington coming out, and who knows if this is true or not, but saying that it has helped Ukraine kill Russian generals and to sink the Moskva, which is the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. And I also say there's evidence to suggest that the U.S. has sabotaged peace negotiations. There was that, the Washington Post article that came out. But there's, Blinken hasn't met with Lavrov since how long has it been? Since before the Russian invasion.
Right. In the U.S. has, Turkey and Israel who are in the positions to negotiate here. The U.S. has pushed Israel to give more aid to Ukraine, although Russia also had a big role in contributing to the deterioration of the relationship there. But also, if you look at Turkey, the U.S. has pushed Turkey to give its S-400 missile systems purchased from Russia to Ukraine to shoot down Russian jets, when Turkey is one of these countries that can actually have diplomacy with the two different nations. But we also recently saw Boris Johnson apparently went to Kiev and essentially told Zelensky not to negotiate, and that the West wasn't really to negotiate. We've heard the same thing from the Turkish foreign minister, saying that for some in NATO, they're hoping for a longer conflict.
Absolutely. So, but then we also have rhetoric from the other side, and some of this might be posturing, I guess, to concede that a little bit, but it's incredibly dangerous. I mean, it should be alarming when Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says, "quote NATO in essence is engaged in a war with Russia through a proxy and is arming that proxy. War means war." And the speaker of the Russian State Duma said on May 7th, quote, "The U.S. is taking part in the military operation in Ukraine. Today, Washington is basically coordinating and engineering military operations, thus directly participating in the military actions against our country." And then again, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev warned May 12th that, quote, "NATO is risking a full-fledged nuclear war by supplying Ukraine with weapons and intelligence." And like I said, I mean, you don't know how much of that is posturing when they talk about the threat of nuclear war, but I mean, just any person, any third party observing this, seeing confrontationalism between two nuclear powers, stating that, de facto they're essentially at war, I think that's kind of a reasonable observation to be making.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
so
and
on,
oh, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I don't know if you're gonna talk about this, but Lindsey Graham gave an interview on Fox News Sunday about that particular op-ed, and one of the things he talked about in there is Putin no longer had an off-ramp, and that the U.S. escalation in Ukraine would eventually lead Putin to use chemical or nuclear weapons, and then at that time NATO would invoke Article 5 and go to war in Ukraine. And so, we're even, I know in his March 10th interview, he was saying it's preposterous that there's going to be a nuclear war, but by May 10th, he's saying that, yeah, there's going to be one, and that's fine.
Yeah, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, it seems like, okay, well, we want to make Putin lose and we want to put him against the ropes, but we know that if we do that, he might use nukes, or he will use nukes, is what we're trying to say, and then that will engage Article 5. And it seems like his reasoning for engaging Article 5 is so tenuous. It's, oh, the radioactive fallout from Ukraine will blow over NATO countries, and therefore that would be seen as an Article 5 event.
Yeah, it's, I hope just his fantasy of how, he sees us getting to war. However, at the same time, it is very concerning that, he's in. I guess in that interview, Brett Baer did ask a couple times. He was like, look, Tom Friedman even said that this is getting kind of dangerous. But overall, there really aren't a lot of people in the mainstream giving a whole lot of pushback to this narrative. It's generally accepted as, yeah, fine, this is what we're gonna do here. We're gonna end up going to war in Ukraine, and I gotta say, Pat, it's very concerning, and it's this crazy thing we have too, especially in Congress. What we've seen in the past couple of weeks, where there's almost no Democrats or none voting against this massive $40 billion, mostly military aid bill for Ukraine, and it's what 68 total Republicans in the House and Senate end up voting against this. Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, and then some of the people that I think are usually bad on China, but sometimes get Russia right for that reason, like the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world. And so there are, this dynamic where there actually some of the best people in Congress right now are Republicans. Like even Barbara Lee has now gone to Ukraine, and James Corden has done a lot of great writing on this, how there's a lot of the progressive left that has drifted away from the anti-war movement, and you've had not necessarily, a flat out move towards the anti-war movement by even some Republicans, but on some issues you have had some Republicans drift in a less interventionist direction. And then at the same time, in the Republican Party, you have the worst hawks in Congress. There's nobody worse than Lindsey Graham and Adam Kinzinger on this, right? I mean, these two stand out as being the worst of the worst in Congress, and yet Rand Paul's, another Republican in the Senate. And so just kind of crazy American politics in 2022, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe Mitch McConnell would be one kind of competing for that spot because at the end I talk about on I think May 15th, so 5 days ago, Mitch McConnell comes forward urging Biden to make the designation the state sponsor of terror designation. And then
That
who
can't be true. That's Moscow Mitch, right? I thought he was a puppet of Vladimir Putin. That's what MSNBC told me for 5 years.
well and who was the one who said on the floor of the House that we're at war with Russia right now?
Oh, I forget the name. It was a Democratic representative, some older guy.
Yeah. So I don't know if he makes the list for that. Maybe the vying for the most
I feel
hawkish.
like that was like a slip of the tongue. Now, I guess one more slip of the tongue we can mention again here on the show, just because I feel like I'm going to bring this up for 3 consecutive weeks, is George Bush
Yeah.
slip of the tongue, right? So here you have all like Lindsey Graham saying we got to prosecute Putin. And then you have George Bush admitting on stage that he did what Putin is doing. And I think we would argue that he did it worse, but let's just say it's equal, right? Why aren't we prosecuting George W. Bush? Why are we just laughing at his jokes? I don't get it.
Well, because we're trying to what do they breathe life into? We're trying to save his legacy. Is what we're doing. Is now he's a 75-year-old man, as he joked. 75, and he's just at home in Texas making those paintings of his dogs, and he's just a cuddly old man now. Bygones are bygones.
I suppose. All right, Pat, that's probably a great place to wrap up. Thanks so much for coming back on the show. And you've been writing so much that I've been reading your articles and I really enjoy it, but then I forget to invite you on the show. So we got to try to like do something like bi-weekly or at least monthly because you've been writing so much good stuff. I don't want to not cover it on the show. So thanks so much for coming back on, man. And we'll have to do it again soon.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Kyle. Thanks.